The fluorescent lights of St. Matthew's ICU hummed their familiar midnight song as I checked the monitors on bed 4, my sneakers squeaking against linoleum that had seen too many emergencies and not enough miracles. 17 hours into a double shift, and my bones ached with the kind of exhaustion that coffee stopped fixing months ago. The call came at 2:47 a.m. Trauma incoming, multiple gunshot wounds, no identification, and I felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that reminded me why I chose this work despite everything it had cost me. They wheeled him in like a broken god, this man who would change everything, his white shirt soaked crimson, and his face a canvas of violence. 3 bullets, they told me, chest and shoulder and abdomen, and I counted the holes in his flesh, like reading a story written in blood. The paramedics spoke in clipped, urgent tones, but my attention caught on details that didn't fit the typical gang shooting or robbery gone wrong. His watch first, a Patek Philippe that cost more than I would earn in 5 years, still ticking faithfully on a wrist that might never move again. His hands next, large and elegant despite the scars across his knuckles, old wounds that spoke of violence survived before tonight. 2 men in dark suits had arrived with the ambulance, hovering at the edges of the trauma bay like shadows with purpose. I noticed them because they noticed everything, their eyes scanning exits and staff and equipment with professional assessment. When the police cruiser pulled into the emergency bay, those men dissolved into the hospital corridors, like smoke through fingers, gone before anyone could question why they had been there at all. We stabilized him through sheer stubbornness, my hands steady even when his heart stuttered twice on the table. Dr. Chen called him lucky, but I had seen lucky, and this wasn't it. This was someone fighting death with the same ferocity that had put him here. They assigned him to my section because Maria called in sick, and because the universe has a cruel sense of humor I stopped believing in years ago. John Doe, the chart read, approximately 34 years old, and I stood beside his bed in the quiet aftermath of crisis, studying the face beneath the bruises. Strong jaw shadowed with stubble, cheekbones that suggested aristocratic bloodlines or careful genetics, a mouth that even in unconsciousness held a firm line, neither peaceful nor pained, but determined. The nurse's station buzzed with whispers I pretended not to hear. Mob hit someone suggested. Cartel maybe. Drug deal. We collected theories like baseball cards in this place, building stories for the nameless bodies that passed through our care. I touched the rail of his bed, watching his chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, and wondered which theory came closest to the truth. His vitals were barely stable, hovering in that precarious space between fighting and surrendering. I should have moved on, checked my other patients, documented and delegated, and detached the way they taught us. Instead, I lingered, drawn by something I couldn't name in the battered landscape of his face. Maybe it was the way his fingers twitched against the sheets, reaching for something even in unconsciousness. Maybe it was my own exhaustion breaking down the walls I had built since my mother died, in a room just like this one. I checked his IV line for the 3rd time, adjusted his oxygen, smoothed the sheet across his chest with hands that had no business being so gentle with a stranger. Outside the window, the city sprawled dark and indifferent, full of secrets and violence, and people who would never know this man existed. But I knew. And standing there in the blue glow of monitors that measured his fading life, I made him a silent promise I had no right to make. You will survive this night. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. 1 week passed in the rhythm of beeping monitors and shallow breaths that I counted like prayers I no longer believed in. John Doe survived that first night and the next, and the 5 after that, his body clinging to life with a stubbornness that defied every medical textbook I had ever read. I watched for signs the others missed, the slight flutter of his eyelids when I changed his bandages, the way his heart rate steadied when I spoke softly near his bed. the almost imperceptible improvement in his oxygen saturation that told me his lungs were fighting their way back from the edge. Small victories, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. Dr. Henry Ashworth called the meeting on a Tuesday afternoon, gathering the ICU staff in the cramped conference room that smelled of stale coffee and difficult decisions. He stood at the head of the table with his silver hair perfectly styled and his expensive tie knotted just so, every inch the hospital administrator who had never held a dying patient's hand in the middle of the night. "We need to discuss resource allocation," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble and just as cold. "The unidentified patient in bed 7 has shown no significant improvement, and we have families waiting for ICU beds, patients with people who love them, people who will notice if they live or die." I felt my spine straighten before I consciously decided to speak. "His brain activity has increased 12% since admission," I said, and I heard the slight tremor in my own voice that betrayed how much this mattered. "His wounds are healing without infection. His autonomic responses suggest." Ashworth's eyes found mine across the table, and something in them made my words die in my throat. A flatness, a warning, a threat wrapped in professional courtesy. "Nurse Bennett," he said, "your dedication is noted, but sentimentality cannot guide medical decisions. Without identification or family consent, this patient is consuming resources that could save lives. We can actually verify matter." The meeting ended with a scheduled review in 3 days, but I understood what had really happened. I had been marked. That night I worked my shift with a new awareness prickling along my skin, a sense of being watched that I couldn't shake no matter how many times I checked the empty hallways. I was adjusting John Doe's 4 at 3 a.m. when movement caught the corner of my eye. A man in a dark suit stood at the end of the corridor, his phone raised toward the room, the tiny light of his camera capturing something he had no right to document. "Hey," I called out, already moving toward him, but he was faster. By the time I reached the spot where he had stood, only the faint scent of expensive cologne remained, proof that I hadn't imagined him. I returned to John Doe's bedside with my hands trembling and my heart hammering against my ribs. Someone was watching. Someone wanted to know if this man lived or died. And Dr. Ashworth's cold eyes had told me everything I needed to know about which outcome certain people preferred. I pulled a chair close to the bed and settled in for the long hours ahead. Fear had taken root in my chest like a seed waiting to bloom into something terrible, but I had made a promise in the blue glow of monitors 7 nights ago. I intended to keep it. The note waited in my locker like a coiled snake, white paper folded once with letters cut from magazines like something out of a crime drama I would have laughed at under different circumstances. "Stop interfering." 2 words that turned my blood to ice water and made my fingers tremble as I held the evidence of someone watching, someone close enough to know which locker belonged to me, someone bold enough to threaten a nurse in her own hospital. I reported it to security, because that was what reasonable people did, people who still believed in systems and protection, and the basic decency of institutions. The guard, a heavy-set man named Martinez, who had never looked twice at me in 3 years of working the same building, examined the note with the enthusiasm of someone checking expiration dates on milk cartons. "Probably a prank," he said. "Probably someone messing with you. These things happen. Don't worry about it." His dismissal felt like a door closing on any hope that the normal world could help me now. I returned to my shift with the note tucked into my pocket, like a talisman of warning, its weight imperceptible and enormous all at once. The man appeared at 4 p.m. during the shift change chaos, when visitors and staff mixed in the corridors, and anyone could be anyone. He wore a suit that cost more than my monthly salary, charcoal gray with a subtle sheen, and his face had the kind of handsome that came with danger attached. Dark hair silvering at the temples, eyes the color of winter ice. He approached the nurse's station with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "I am Thomas Crawford," he said, and something in his voice made the other nurses fall silent and find reasons to be elsewhere. I am the patient's cousin, and I require information about his condition. I looked at this Thomas Crawford with his expensive suit and his cold eyes, and I saw the same sharp edges I had noticed in the men who vanished when police arrived. Cousin, I repeated, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. Do you have documentation to verify your relationship? Because hospital policy requires proper authorization before we can release patient information. His smile did not reach his eyes. A formality I am sure we can work around given the circumstances. I cannot work around anything I said, and I watched something flicker in his expression, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect, or calculation of a different approach. He produced a card from his breast pocket, cream-colored with a phone number embossed in black, nothing else, no name, no company, no explanation. When you are ready to discuss options, he said, and then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of sandalwood and the certainty that I had just met someone far more dangerous than the threat in my locker. The tampering happened at midnight, that quiet hour when even the ICU feels suspended between heartbeats. I noticed because I had trained myself to notice, because paranoia had become my constant companion, because some instinct made me check John Doe's 4 line one more time before documenting his vitals. The drip rate was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong, but subtly adjusted in a way that would have increased his sedation beyond safe levels, would have depressed his respiratory function, would have killed him slowly while everyone assumed his injuries had simply won. My hands shook as I corrected it. Someone had access. Someone had knowledge. Someone wanted this man dead badly enough to infiltrate a hospital and tamper with medical equipment, and they would keep trying until they succeeded. I sat beside his bed in the darkness, watching his chest rise and fall, and understood with terrible clarity that I was all that stood between this stranger and the grave. I started sleeping in the hospital because home had become a place where shadows moved wrong, and every creak of my apartment floor sounded like footsteps that did not belong to me. The on-call room became my sanctuary, its narrow bed and thin blankets a small price for the proximity to John Doe, for the ability to check on him every hour, every half hour, every 15 minutes when the fear grew teeth and gnawed at my nerves. The other nurses noticed. They whispered about dedication and obsession and the line between them, but none of them had found notes in their lockers. None of them had caught someone tampering with a patient's VU. None of them understood that walking away meant walking away from a man who would die without someone watching over him. I talked to him during the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the ICU settled into its rhythm of mechanical breathing and soft alarms. I told him about my mother first, how she had been a nurse too, how she had taught me that healing was not just medicine but presence, but witness, but refusing to let someone suffer alone. I told him about the cancer that ate her from the inside while I watched helplessly, about the medical bills that accumulated like snow in a blizzard until I was buried beneath them, about the 3 jobs I worked during nursing school and the exhaustion that had become my permanent companion. I told him about my empty apartment and my emptier life, about the friends who drifted away when I could never make brunch or birthday parties, about the loneliness that had settled into my bones so deeply I had forgotten what warmth felt like. And sometimes, when I spoke, his fingers twitched against the white sheets. Small movements, barely perceptible, but I saw them. I cataloged them like evidence of miracles I was not supposed to believe in anymore. Dr. Ashworth called me to his office on a Thursday morning, his desk gleaming between us like a barrier built from authority and barely concealed hostility. The committee has reviewed the case, he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge passing sentence. Life support will be terminated on Monday. We cannot justify the resources for an unidentified patient with no reasonable expectation of recovery, I argued. I presented my documentation of improvement, the finger movements, the heart rate patterns, the brain activity that told me someone was still in there fighting to come back. Ashworth listened with the patience of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for me to exhaust myself against it. Monday, he repeated, and I recognized dismissal when I heard it. I walked out of his office with 4 days left and no options within the boundaries of the law. That night, I retrieved Thomas Crawford's card from my wallet, where it had lived since he pressed it into my hand, the cream-colored rectangle feeling like a contract I was about to sign in blood I could not afford to lose. My fingers trembled as I dialed. He answered on the second ring as if he had been waiting. "I need help," I said, and the words tasted like surrender and salvation in equal measure. His response was immediate. "Tell me everything." I did, and when I finished, when I had laid out every threat and every sign of hope, and every desperate reason why this stranger deserved to live, Thomas Crawford said the words that changed my trajectory forever. "Meet me tomorrow. I think we can help each other." The coffee shop Thomas Crawford chose for our meeting sat in a neighborhood I had never visited. Tucked between a tailor shop with suits in the window that cost more than my car, and a restaurant with no prices on the menu visible from the street. He was already seated when I arrived, a small table in the back corner where he could watch every entrance and exit, and I realized as I walked toward him that I was learning to notice these things now, learning to think like prey in a world where predators wore expensive suits and spoke in measured tones. "Sit," he said. And I did, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I did not remember ordering, warmth seeping into fingers that had been cold for days. "The man in that hospital bed is not a John Doe," Thomas began, his voice low enough that I had to lean forward to hear him over the ambient noise of espresso machines and quiet conversations. "His name is Alexander Sinclair, and he is the head of an organization that controls significant portions of this city's commerce, both legitimate and otherwise." I waited for shock to arrive, but found only a strange sense of confirmation, as if some part of me had always known that the man with the scarred knuckles and the expensive watch was not an ordinary victim of violence. "The people who want him dead are led by a man named Richard Montague," Thomas continued, "and they have resources that extend into places you would not expect, places like hospitals, like administrative offices, like the people who decide which patients deserve to live and which should be quietly allowed to die." "Dr. Ashworth," I said, and Thomas nodded with something like approval in his cold eyes. "Among others. If Alexander dies, Montague takes everything. And many people who depend on Sinclair protection will find themselves at the mercy of a man who has none." He slid a folder across the table, and I opened it to find documents with my name on them, my debts itemized with clinical precision, my mother's medical bills and my student loans, and the credit cards I had used to survive when working. 3 jobs still was not enough. "I can make these disappear," Thomas said. "I can ensure your safety from the people who left that note in your locker. All you have to do is what you have already been doing. Keep him alive until he can wake up and protect himself." I should have felt manipulated. I should have felt trapped. Instead, I thought of Alexander's face in the pale hospital light, the small movements of his fingers when I spoke to him, the way his heart rate steadied when I sat beside his bed during the darkest hours of the night. I thought of my mother and how she had taught me that nursing was not about following rules, but about protecting the vulnerable even when the system failed them. I thought of the note in my locker, and the tampered IV, and the deadline on Monday that would end a life I had fought to preserve. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, and the words felt less like surrender than I had expected, felt instead like a door opening onto a path I had already been walking without knowing its name. Thomas smiled, and for the first time it almost reached his eyes. "Keep doing exactly what you have been doing. Watch over him, document everything, and when suspicious things happen, call this number immediately. His people will be nearby, invisible but present, ready to intervene if Montague's agents try again." I nodded and stood to leave, but Thomas caught my wrist with a grip that reminded me how dangerous he truly was. "One more thing, Eleanor. You are choosing a side in a war you do not fully understand. Once you walk through this door, there is no walking back. I met his gaze and thought of Alexander Sinclair, thought of the life flickering in his broken body, thought of everything I had already risked to keep a stranger breathing. I chose my side the moment I stopped them from killing him, I said. I am just making it official now. I walked out of the coffee shop into pale afternoon sunlight and did not look back. 3 weeks after they brought him to me, broken and bleeding and nameless, I was checking his vitals in the pale gray light of early morning when Alexander Sinclair opened his eyes. Gray. The color hit me first, gray like storm clouds gathering over the lake, gray like the steel of the surgical instruments I had watched doctors use to pull bullets from his chest, gray and piercing and alive in a way that stopped my breath in my throat and made my fingers freeze against the pulse point on his wrist. He moved before I could speak, his hand shooting up to grab my arm with a strength that should have been impossible for a man who had been unconscious for 21 days, who had lost enough blood to kill someone twice, who had been hovering in the space between life and death while I kept vigil and talked to him about my mother and my loneliness and all the secret things I had never told another living soul. His grip was iron and desperation, and something that might have been fear, and I watched confusion flood his features as his eyes darted around the room, taking in the monitors and the IV lines and the hospital bed that had held his body, while his mind wandered somewhere I could not follow. You are safe, I said, keeping my voice low and steady the way I had learned to do with patients emerging from trauma, with frightened children, with wounded animals who might bite if they felt cornered. You are in a hospital. You were hurt, but you are going to be okay. His eyes snapped back to mine, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, like he was looking through my skin and into the architecture of my bones, searching for something he could not name. Who are you? He asked, and his voice was a ruin, ragged and raw from 3 weeks of disuse, from the tube that had helped him breathe when his body forgot how. Eleanor. I told him. Eleanor Bennett. I am your nurse. I have been taking care of you. Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of something that moved too fast for me to catch and name. His grip on my wrist did not loosen, but it changed, became less desperate and more deliberate, his thumb pressing against my pulse as if he was checking to make sure I was real. I remember he started, then stopped, his brow furrowing with the effort of dragging memories from wherever they had been hiding while his body healed. Gunfire. Blood. Someone dragging me into a car. And then nothing except darkness and cold and a voice. He looked at me with an intensity that made heat climb up my neck and settle in my cheeks. Your voice, he said. I heard you in the dark. You talked about your mother. You talked about being alone. I should have felt exposed. I should have felt embarrassed that this stranger, this dangerous man Thomas had warned me about, had heard the secrets I whispered in the safety of what I thought was his unconsciousness. Instead, I felt something like recognition pass between us, like he had found me the same way I had found him, two people reaching toward each other across an impossible distance. I did, I admitted. I thought maybe you could hear me. I thought maybe it would help. His fingers loosened on my wrist, but he did not let go entirely, his touch sliding down to rest against my palm in a gesture that felt like gratitude made physical. It did, he said, and those 2 words carried a weight I was not prepared for. You kept me here. I should have pulled away. I should have been professional, clinical, distant. Instead, I let my hand rest in his and felt the warmth of his skin and wondered what I had gotten myself into. The doctors called it remarkable. They used words like unprecedented and medically extraordinary when they reviewed his charts and watched him sitting up in bed only 4 days after opening his eyes, watched him walking the length of his room with my arms steadying him only 6 days after that. They did not know what I knew, that Alexander Sinclair had spent 3 weeks in darkness, listening to my voice and fighting his way back to consciousness through sheer force of will, that the same determination that had built an empire from his father's ashes was now pouring itself into the reconstruction of his broken body. I learned the full scope of who he was in fragments, in conversations that started clinical and wandered into territory that made my pulse quicken and my professional detachment crumble. Thomas brought files to the hospital, speaking to Alexander in low, urgent tones about territory and operations and names I did not recognize. And I would busy myself with checking monitors and adjusting IV lines while absorbing every word that painted the picture of the man I had saved. He controlled 40% of the city's shipping interests. His organization employed over 2,000 people in businesses that ranged from legitimate construction firms to enterprises that existed in the shadows between legal and criminal. He had enemies in every borough and allies in places that would have shocked the politicians who publicly condemned organized crime while privately accepting its contributions. And through it all, through every revelation that should have sent me running, he watched me with those gray eyes that seemed to track my every movement with an intensity that unsettled me in ways I could not name. "You should be afraid of me," he said one evening, when the hospital had grown quiet, and I was changing the dressing on his chest wound, my fingers careful against the puckered skin where bullets had torn through muscle and grazed bone. "Most people are." I met his gaze and felt the weight of it settle into my stomach, felt the heat of his skin beneath my fingertips, and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under my palm. "I watched you die 3 times on my operating table," I told him. "I held your heart in my hands while the surgeons worked to repair what those bullets destroyed. I think I have seen too much of you to be afraid of what you are on the outside." Something flickered in his expression, something vulnerable that he quickly buried beneath the mask I was learning to recognize as his defense against a world that had taught him softness was weakness. "You saved my life, Eleanor. I know what that cost you, what risks you took." Thomas told me about the note, the tampered IV, the deadline Ashworth tried to enforce. "You stood against all of it for a stranger." I finished the dressing and stepped back, needing distance from the pull of him, from the gravitational force that seemed to drag me closer every time I entered his room. "You are not a stranger," I admitted. "I do not know how to explain it, but from the first night you felt like someone I was supposed to protect." He reached for my hand, and I let him take it, let his fingers intertwine with mine in a gesture that crossed every professional boundary I had left. "Then we are the same," he said quietly. "Because from the moment I heard your voice in the darkness, you felt like someone I was supposed to find." The door opened, and Dr. Ashworth entered without knocking, his eyes sweeping the room and landing on our joined hands with an expression that made ice form in my veins. His gaze moved to Alexander, to the man sitting upright and alert when he should have been dead weeks ago, and I watched suspicion crystallize into something harder and more dangerous. "Remarkable recovery," Mr. Sinclair Ashworth said, and the name hung in the air like an accusation. Alexander smiled, and for the first time I saw the predator beneath the patient, the man who commanded an empire and destroyed those who threatened it. "I had excellent care," he replied, and his thumb traced circles against my palm in a gesture that felt like both comfort and warning. That night, after Ashworth left, and the shadows grew long across the hospital floor, Alexander pulled me close and spoke against my hair. "He knows who I am now, which means Montague will know I am alive by morning. You need to understand, Eleanor. From this moment forward, you are in danger." I pressed my hand against his chest and felt his heart beating strong and steady beneath my touch. "I know," I told him. "I have known since the moment I chose to save you. What I did not say was that I would make the same choice again. What I did not say was that somewhere between the first night and this one, protecting him had become something I could not imagine stopping." The gunfire started at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I will remember that time for the rest of my life, because I had just glanced at the clock above the nurse's station when the first shot shattered the window at the end of the corridor and sent glass spraying across the linoleum floor like diamonds made of violence. I froze for a single heartbeat, my training screaming at me to move while my body refused to obey. And then Alexander was there, his hand closing around my arm with a grip that brooked no argument as he pulled me away from the exposed hallway and toward the supply closet 3 doors down from his room. He was still weak. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched with each step, could hear it in the ragged edge of his breathing, but he moved with a purpose that transformed weakness into something that looked almost like strength. More shots rang out, closer now, and I heard shouting in a language I did not recognize, heard the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor, heard someone screaming in a voice that might have belonged to one of the night shift nurses I had worked beside for 3 years. Alexander shoved me into the closet and followed, pressing me against the back wall with his body as a shield between me and the door. And I could feel every labored breath he took, could feel his heart pounding against my spine with a rhythm that spoke of fear and fury in equal measure. His hand found mine in the darkness and squeezed, and I understood that this was what he had warned me about. This was the danger that came with choosing to save a man like him. The sounds of violence grew louder and then suddenly stopped, replaced by a silence that felt more terrifying than the gunfire had been, and I pressed my face against Alexander's back and breathed in the scent of hospital antiseptic and something underneath that was purely him. Thomas's voice cut through the quiet, calling Alexander's name, and I felt the tension drain from Alexander's body, even as his grip on my hand tightened. We emerged from the closet to find 4 men in dark suits standing over 3 bodies that wore the same tactical gear I had seen in movies about military operations, and Thomas was already on his phone barking orders while his eyes swept over Alexander with an assessment that made my stomach clench with worry. Alexander took 2 steps toward Thomas, and then his knees buckled, and I was there before he hit the ground, catching him with arms that had grown strong from years of lifting patients and fighting to keep people alive. Blood was seeping through his hospital gown, his wounds reopened from the exertion, and I lowered him to the floor and pressed my hands against his chest and felt the warm, wet pulse of his life trying to escape through my fingers. "Stay with me," I told him, echoing words he had not yet spoken, but somehow I knew were coming, and his eyes found mine with an intensity that burned through the haze of pain and exhaustion. He lifted one trembling hand to cup my face, his palm rough against my cheek, and when he spoke his voice was barely a whisper. "Stay with me, Eleanor." I did not know if it was a request or a command, but kneeling there on a floor slick with blood and surrounded by the aftermath of violence, I knew my answer was the same either way. I pressed my forehead to his and felt his breath warm against my lips and whispered back, "I am not going anywhere." They took me from the hospital in the back of a black SUV with tinted windows, so dark the city outside became nothing more than smeared lights and shadow, and I sat pressed against the leather seat with Alexander's blood still drying on my scrubs and my hands still trembling from the adrenaline that had not yet faded from my system. Thomas sat in the front passenger seat, speaking rapidly into his phone, coordinating something that sounded like a military operation, and I caught fragments about securing perimeters and sweeping for surveillance and confirming the location was clean. Alexander was beside me, pale and sweating from the effort of walking to the vehicle, and his hand found mine in the darkness between us, and held on like I was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted off its axis. We drove for 47 minutes through neighborhoods I did not recognize, until we reached a gate that opened onto a private road lined with trees that blocked any view from the street. The house that emerged from the darkness was not a house at all, but a fortress, disguised as a mansion. All stone walls and iron fixtures and windows that I would later learn were bulletproof glass, designed to withstand military-grade ammunition. Thomas helped Alexander inside while I followed in a daze, taking in the marble floors and the artwork on the walls and the sheer, overwhelming wealth that surrounded me like a physical weight pressing against my chest. A woman named Margaret met us in the foyer and led me to a suite on the second floor that was larger than my entire apartment, showed me a closet already stocked with clothing in my size, pointed out the bathroom with its rainfall shower and heated floors, and told me that anything I needed would be provided. I stood in the center of the room after she left and felt the walls closing in despite the expansive space, felt the reality of what had happened crashing over me in waves. My apartment had been ransacked, Thomas told me later. Everything I owned had been destroyed or searched. My mother's photographs scattered across the floor, her jewelry box smashed open and emptied. The life I had built over 28 years had been erased in a single night by men who saw me as nothing more than leverage against the man recovering in the suite next to mine. Alexander insisted on seeing me every day, at first under the pretense of medical checkups, but soon abandoning any excuse at all. I would sit in the chair beside his bed, and he would watch me with those gray eyes that seemed to see past every wall I had ever constructed, and our conversations would start with his vital signs and wander into territory that felt more dangerous than the bullets that had torn through the hospital corridor. He told me about his father, a man who had built the Sinclair empire from nothing and died when Alexander was 19, leaving behind a legacy of blood and power and expectation. He told me about the violence he had tried to contain, the legitimate businesses he had cultivated to slowly shift the organization away from its criminal roots, the enemies he had made by refusing to operate the way his father had. He told me about the loneliness of command, the way power isolated and corrupted and consumed everything it touched. And I began to see the man beneath the monster, the boy who had inherited an empire he never wanted and spent 15 years trying to transform it into something he could live with. I began to understand that the danger I had sensed in him was not cruelty, but burden, the weight of 1,000 terrible choices made in service of a code he had written himself. The days began to blur together in that fortress of stone and silence, each one measured not by the clock on the wall, but by the small victories of Alexander's recovery, the color returning to his face, the strength returning to his grip, the way he could walk the length of the hallway without leaning against the wall by the 5th day, and climb the stairs without stopping to catch his breath by the 8th. I fell into a rhythm that felt almost domestic despite the armed guards stationed at every entrance and the bulletproof glass that turned the gardens into a painting I could see but never touch, waking each morning to check his vitals and change his bandages, sharing meals in the sunlit breakfast room where he watched me over the rim of his coffee cup with those gray eyes that seemed to catalog every movement I made. Thomas came and went with reports of the war being waged beyond these walls, territories contested and alliances shifting and bodies found in alleys that bore the signature of Montague's cruelty. But Alexander refused to let that darkness into our conversations, steering us instead toward lighter waters whenever I asked about the violence being done in his name. He made me laugh, and that surprised me more than anything else about this strange captivity, this gilded cage I had chosen to enter. He had a dry wit that emerged when I least expected it, observations about the absurdity of his own situation that cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. And I found myself looking forward to our evenings in the library where he would read aloud from books I had never heard of, while I pretended to focus on the medical journals Margaret had procured at my request. He challenged me too, refused to accept the walls I had built around my own history, asked questions that no one had thought to ask in years. "What did you want to be before nursing chose you?" he asked one night. And I told him about the art classes I had taken in high school, the scholarship I had turned down to stay with my mother during her first round of treatment, the dreams I had packed away in boxes I no longer knew how to open. He listened without judgment, without pity, and somehow that made it easier to speak. The photograph was old and creased from being carried in my wallet through 4 years of loss and loneliness. My mother's face smiling up at the camera with a joy I could barely remember her possessing. And I did not realize I was crying until the tears fell onto her image and blurred her features into something I could not recognize. Alexander found me in the window seat of my room, where I had retreated to be alone with my grief. and he did not ask what was wrong or offer platitudes about time healing wounds. He simply sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him through my sleeve, and covered my hand with his in a gesture that held no expectation, no demand, only presence. We stayed like that until the sun set and the room grew dark around us, and neither of us spoke because there were no words for what was passing between us. This recognition of wounds that mirrored each other, this understanding that some losses never heal, but only teach us to carry their weight differently. The morning Thomas burst into the breakfast room with his phone still pressed to his ear and his face drained of all color. I knew before he spoke that our fragile peace had shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. "There is a mole," he said, and the words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire already burning. "Someone inside the organization has been feeding Montague information for weeks, maybe months, and they know where we are." Alexander rose from his chair with a fluidity that belied the wounds still healing beneath his shirt, and I watched the transformation happen in real time. The man who had held my hand in silence becoming something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. The crime boss emerging from beneath the skin of the person I had begun to know. "We have 20 minutes, Thomas continued. Maybe less. They are mobilizing a team and we need to move now." The evacuation happened so fast I could barely process the chaos unfolding around me. Guards appearing from doorways I had not known existed. Weapons being drawn and checked with practiced efficiency. Margaret pressing a bag into my hands containing clothes and cash, and a phone programmed with numbers I did not recognize. Alexander gripped my arm as we moved toward the garage, his fingers tight enough to bruise, and his voice was low and urgent when he spoke. "Stay close to me, Eleanor. Do not let go of my hand, no matter what happens." But the universe has never cared much for the plans we make in moments of desperation, and when the first explosion rocked the east wing of the house, I was thrown sideways into a wall, while Alexander was pulled in the opposite direction by Thomas, who was shouting about a secondary exit and flanking positions and things I could not understand through the ringing in my ears. I scrambled to my feet and tried to follow, but the hallway had filled with smoke and running figures, and I could not tell friend from enemy in the darkness that had descended when the power cut out. A hand closed around my mouth from behind, and I bit down hard enough to taste blood. But there were more hands now, too many to fight, and something sharp pressed against my throat as a voice I did not recognize whispered for me to stop struggling unless I wanted to die right here on this marble floor. They dragged me through a door I had never noticed, and into the cold night air where a van waited with its engine running and its side door already open like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. The last thing I saw before the hood came down over my head was the mansion burning against the sky, flames licking from the windows of the room where I had cried over my mother's photograph while Alexander held my hand in silence. And somewhere in the chaos behind me, I heard him screaming my name with a desperation that sounded like a man watching everything he cared about being ripped away. And I knew that whatever happened next, whatever darkness awaited me in the back of this van speeding toward an unknown destination, Alexander Sinclair would tear this city apart to find me or die trying. The warehouse smelled of rust and damp concrete, and something chemical I could not identify. And when they finally pulled the hood from my head, I had to blink against the harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, like insects trapped in their fixtures. My wrists burned where the zip ties cut into my skin, and my shoulders ached from being held at an unnatural angle for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes, because time had become meaningless in the darkness of that van, counting heartbeats and breaths, and the turns we took through streets I could not see. Richard Montague was smaller than I had imagined. A man of average height with silver hair combed back from a face that might have been handsome once, but had hardened into something cruel, and he sat across from me in a leather chair that looked absurdly out of place in this industrial wasteland, like he had brought his own throne to a kingdom of rust and shadows. "So you are the nurse," he said, and his voice was soft in a way that made my skin crawl because I had learned to fear soft voices in hard men. You are the woman who refused to let Alexander Sinclair die when everyone else was ready to pull the plug and move on with their lives. I said nothing because I knew that anything I offered would be twisted into a weapon, and instead, I focused on cataloging my surroundings the way I had learned to catalog symptoms and warning signs during 4 years of night shifts in the ICU, the two guards by the door with automatic weapons slung across their chests, the windows painted black 15 feet up the wall, the chair I was tied to bolted to the floor, the workbench against the far wall with tools I did not want to think about. Montague leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and studied me with eyes that held no warmth, no mercy, only a calculating interest that reminded me of a cat watching a mouse it had not yet decided to kill. You must be something special, he continued, for Alexander to keep you so close, to risk so much protecting a woman he barely knows, and I find myself curious about what exactly you offer that has made the great Alexander Sinclair so careless. I met his gaze without flinching, because I had stared down death before in hospital rooms where monitors flatlined and families screamed, and there was nothing to do but keep working with steady hands, even when hope had left the building, and I would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing me break. He smiled at my silence and pulled a phone from his pocket, dialing a number I knew by heart, even though I had never called it. And when he spoke into the receiver, his voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who had built an empire on other people's pain. "Alexander," he said, "I have something of yours, and I am giving you 24 hours to surrender yourself and your territories, or I will send her back to you in pieces small enough to fit in a shoebox." I heard Alexander's response through the speaker, a single word that was my name spoken like a prayer and a curse and a promise of violence all tangled together. And then Montague ended the call and left me alone with my guards and my fear and the small, sharp edge of a broken bolt I had found beneath my chair that I was slowly, carefully, working against my restraints because I had not survived this long by waiting for someone else to save me. The broken bolt had done its work in the 6 hours since Montague left me alone with my guards and my fear, sawing through the plastic zip ties one fiber at a time until my wrists were raw and bleeding, but free beneath the loose coils I kept carefully positioned to maintain the illusion of captivity. And I waited in the darkness of that warehouse with my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, while I counted the seconds and listened for any sign that Alexander was coming, or that I was truly alone in this nightmare of rust and shadows and men with guns who looked at me like I was already dead. The first explosion came from the east side of the building, a thunderous boom that shook the floor beneath my bolted chair and sent one of my guards stumbling toward the door with his weapon raised, while the other shouted into a radio that crackled with panicked voices and gunfire so loud it hurt to hear even through the static, and I knew with a certainty that settled into my bones like warmth after a long, cold night that Alexander had come for me just as he promised, just as I knew he would, because the man who had held my hand while I cried over my mother's photograph was not the kind of man who made empty promises. I moved the moment both guards turned toward the chaos erupting beyond the warehouse doors, throwing off my loosened restraints and diving toward the workbench, where I had spotted a heavy wrench among the tools I had tried so hard not to imagine being used against me. And when the first guard spun around at the sound of my movement, I swung with all the strength that 4 years of lifting patients and fighting for their lives had given me, and felt the impact shudder up my arms as he crumpled to the concrete floor. The second guard raised his weapon, but the door behind him exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and twisted metal, and then Alexander was there, bleeding from a wound on his temple and another on his shoulder, his shirt soaked through with red, but his eyes burning with a fury so pure and terrible that for one heartbeat I understood exactly why men feared him, why empires trembled at his name, why Richard Montague had been so desperate to see him dead. The guard fell before he could fire, and Alexander stepped over his body without looking down, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that stole the breath from my lungs, and I dropped the wrench and ran to him across that blood-slicked floor with my bare feet and my racing heart, and my arms reaching for the man who had turned this city inside out to find me. He caught me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I did not care because I could feel him trembling against me. This dangerous, powerful man shaking like he was the one who had been afraid, and his voice broke when he pressed his face into my hair and whispered my name like it was the only word he remembered how to say. Thomas appeared in the doorway to report that Montague was dead, and the building was secured, but Alexander did not release me, did not even look up, just held me in the wreckage of that warehouse while the sounds of battle faded into silence around us. "I thought I lost you," he said finally, pulling back just enough to look at my face with eyes that held no walls, no shields, nothing but raw and devastating vulnerability. I touched his cheek, smearing blood I could not tell was his or someone else's, and I smiled despite everything. "You found me." The war ended on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I had been taken from that warehouse with blood on my feet, and Alexander's arms around me like he would never let go. And in the quiet that followed the violence, I found myself standing in his study, with sunlight streaming through windows that had been reinforced with bulletproof glass, watching him pretend to read documents, while his hands trembled so slightly that anyone else might have missed it, but I had spent too many nights monitoring the small movements of his body, the twitch of his fingers, the flutter of his pulse, to miss anything about him now. He had called me here to discuss my future, his voice carefully neutral when he summoned me through Thomas. And I knew before I entered the room that he was going to try to let me go because I had learned to read Alexander Sinclair the way I read patient charts, finding the truth in what he tried to hide rather than what he chose to show. "I have arranged everything," he said without looking up from papers I knew he was not actually seeing. "New identity documents. A bank account with enough money that you will never have to work another double shift in your life. A house in a city far from here where no one will ever connect you to what happened, where you can start over and forget that any of this was real." His voice cracked on the last word, and he covered it with a cough that fooled neither of us. And I watched his jaw clench as he waited for me to accept his offering, his sacrifice, his desperate attempt to give me the normal life he believed I deserved instead of the dangerous world he inhabited. "You could go back to nursing," he continued, still refusing to meet my eyes, "somewhere safe, somewhere clean, somewhere that does not smell of gunpowder and require armed guards at every entrance. And you could find someone who does not have blood on his hands, someone who can give you the kind of life that does not involve looking over your shoulder for enemies who want to use you as leverage against a man who has done terrible things." I crossed the room while he spoke, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet that had probably cost more than my mother's entire house. And I stood before his desk until he had no choice but to look up at me with those gray eyes that had opened 6 weeks ago to find me standing over his hospital bed, the eyes of a man who had heard my voice in the darkness and fought his way back to consciousness because some part of him had decided I was worth waking for. His hands were shaking openly now, the documents abandoned, and when I walked around the desk and took those trembling hands in mine, I felt him flinch like my touch was something he did not deserve, something too precious for a man who had built an empire on violence and fear and the bones of his enemies. "I choose this," I said, and watched his expression shatter into something raw and wondering and terrified. "I choose you." He kissed me like I was air, and he had been drowning, like I was the voice in the darkness that had called him back from death, like the Empire and the enemies, and the blood on both our hands meant nothing compared to this moment, this choice, this woman who had refused to let him die and would not let him push her away now. The clinic opens at 7 in the morning, but I arrive at 6 to check the supply room and review the patient files that accumulated overnight, a habit I developed during those long ICU shifts that feels like another lifetime ago, even though only 6 months have passed since I stood in Alexander's study and chose a future I never could have imagined when I was just a nurse drowning in debt and loneliness and the endless beeping of machines keeping strangers alive. The Sinclair Community Health Center sits in the heart of the neighborhood where I grew up, where my mother worked double shifts cleaning office buildings until her body gave out, where families like mine fell through the cracks of a healthcare system that only cared about those who could pay. And every morning when I unlock the doors and turn on the lights, I think about how strange it is that a crime lord's money built these walls. But the healing that happens inside them is as real and pure as anything I did in that sterile hospital where I first saw Alexander's battered face and decided he deserved to live. The staff has grown from 3 to 12 in the months since we opened. Doctors and nurses and counselors who ask no questions about where the funding comes from because they understand that sometimes light grows from dark soil, and I have learned to hold both truths in my heart without letting either one destroy the other. I am checking the blood pressure cuff calibration when I hear footsteps behind me, familiar and unhurried, and I do not need to turn around to know that Alexander has followed me again, despite my insistence that he does not need to escort me to work every single morning, like I might disappear if he lets me out of his sight for too long. He catches me at the door of the exam room, his hand warm on my hip as he turns me to face him. And even now, after 6 months of waking up beside him, I feel my breath catch at the sight of those gray eyes that opened in a hospital bed and found me waiting, the eyes of a man who built an empire on blood and fear, but looks at me like I am the only thing in his world worth protecting. Thomas handles most of the business now. The meetings and negotiations and careful maintenance of territories that I have learned not to ask about, and Alexander has stepped back in ways his father never did, carving out space for something softer, even if the darkness still lives beneath his skin, and always will. He is still dangerous, and I am not foolish enough to forget it. Still powerful in ways that make other men cross streets to avoid him. But when he traces his thumb across my cheekbone and asks if I will be home for dinner, his voice holds none of the ice that freezes his enemies in their tracks. I kiss him goodbye the way I do every morning, slow and thorough, and he makes a sound against my mouth that tells me he is considering carrying me back to the car and making us both very late for our respective days. Go, I tell him, pressing my palm against his chest where the scars from Montague's bullets have faded to silver lines I trace with my fingers in the dark. He goes, reluctantly, and I watch through the window as his car pulls away before I turn back to the clinic that bears his name in letters small enough that only those who know will understand. Some lives are written in straight lines, predictable progressions from birth to death, with all the expected stops along the way. Ours was written in bullets and bandages, in defiance and devotion, in a choice I made in a dark ICU when everyone told me to let go and I refused. The nurse who would not unplug him, the Mafia boss who opened his eyes, the beginning we built from the wreckage of everything that tried to destroy us.